Well, hello everyone. I have 2 o'clock here in Chicago, so I think we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to FCA International's webinar on hazard communication for the finishing trades. I'll be your host today. My name is Mike Hartnett. A little background is I spent about 15 years as an IUPAT painter working in the Chicagoland area. I then went and got my bachelor's degree in safety, labor safety and health from National Labor College and a master's of educational technology. And now I work as a safety liaison for FCA amongst other clients that I work for. I like to bring my experience from the field that your membership that applies to your membership specifically. So I think it's a good match. Today we're going to be talking about hazard communication. The Globally Harmonized System is the system of hazard communication that OSHA has mandated. It's an international system that is used throughout Europe and the rest of the world as well. So if you were here for our last webinar where we went over the top 10 citations for finishing contractors, you'll remember that number 4 was hazard communication, right? We had a lot of other issues had to do with fall protection, right? A little bit on PPE. But hazard communication is low-hanging fruit, okay? It's very easy for OSHA to see when it's not being complied with, but at the same time, as an employer, it's very easy for you to comply with that, with the requirements for it. Overview is that we used to run on the hazard communication standard from 1994, which gave our employees, gave workers the right to know. It was updated in 2012, and they changed the right to know to the right to understand. And this has to do with kind of the shift that OSHA has made in that time about training and how we need to make sure that we don't just go through the motions, but provide training that our employees can understand. And also, as far as labeling on hazardous material, that they have material, ability to understand what those labels mean as opposed to just know. So also the hazard communication standards now align with the United Nations Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, known as the GHS. So what this allows in this new global age is when we have chemicals that are coming in from other countries, we're all on the same system so that it's a pretty much universal hazard communication standard. So the main changes on the hazard communication standards from 2012 versus the 1994 version is they changed the hazard classification, they changed the labeling, and they changed the safety data sheets. Okay? There's also other changes that are affected from it, definitions and effective dates. We'll discuss those. So throughout this training, when you see something in bold with asterisk next to it, it's going to be an area that was specifically revised in the Hazard Communication Standard 2012. So many of the standards stayed the same, but there are quite a few that changed with the newer standard. So first we're going to start out with a discussion of the purpose of the Hazard Communication Standard, the scope, and then definitions. Okay. The purpose is to ensure that all chemicals are classified, right? That the information is classified by hazard, and that information is communicated to the employers, right, through proper labeling when it manufacturing, and to the employees when an employer gets that material and has the employee utilize it, they need to make sure they communicate these hazards through a hazard communication program, labeling, safety data sheets, and training. Okay. And the purpose was also to make sure that the requirements were consistent with the globally harmonized system, so that in a new global economy, we had more synergies there. So the scope is that it comes on three parts, right? Chemical importers and manufacturers are required to classify the health hazards of their chemicals. They have to look into what the health hazards are and define those health hazards in a specific method on a specific format called an SDS, safety data sheet. It requires that they communicate those hazards to the employers that they sell these products to and label the chemical containers. And then the third part is that employers are required to communicate this information to their employees. Now, the standard applies to employers who use chemicals in the workplace, which is clearly the finishing trades, and then manufacturers and distributors of hazardous chemicals. At this point, the scope also covers all hazardous chemical substances, dilute solutions, and mixtures. Okay, and there's specific items that are not covered under this that really don't apply to the finishing trades. And this is a spot where I want to kind of discuss definition. What is a hazardous chemical substance, right? A hazardous chemical substance is any substance that has health issues, that can cause health issues or injury to employees. Okay? If it has a health hazard or a physical hazard, then it is considered a chemical substance. This is not only liquids or gases, right? Liquids and gases make up the majority of your chemical substances, but it's possible that other chemical substances, hazardous chemical substances, are around. When you go into a steel fabrication shop, in an ironworking shop, they have SDSs for all the steel and iron that comes into their facility, because they're going to be heating that and utilizing it in welding instances that are going to then make that steel I-beam a hazardous chemical substance. So it's not just liquids and gases. Any hazardous chemical substance needs to have an SDS. So the scope also defines the employer's responsibilities. Okay, we need to make sure that the labels that are on containers for hazardous chemicals are not removed or defaced. If they are removed, defaced, or illegible due to the material getting on them or weather or whatever else is going on, it is that employer's responsibility to replace those labels. Okay, we need to make sure that we protect those labels so that they're legible. You also need to maintain copies of all safety data sheets for hazardous chemicals used in the workplace, and maintain a written hazard communication program. And we'll go over each of these a little bit later in this presentation. And last but not least is the training of your employees. Okay, you have to train your employees on what hazardous chemicals are, what labeling is required, what an SDS is, and the written hazard communication program, which is going to define how you label, where your SDS is, what your list of chemicals that you have on the site. All that information will be defined within your written hazard communication program. This training is required at orientation, right, prior to the employee being exposed to the hazardous chemicals in your work area. It also needs to be have an annual review, okay? And then last but not least, when a new chemical hazard is introduced into the workplace. And we'll get more in depth on all these, including the training requirements in this presentation. So hazard classification. This is where chemical reporters are required to determine what the hazards, and manufacturers are required to determine what hazards and the level of those hazards that their chemicals have. Okay, so both health and physical hazards need to be specified on the SDS. So it's broken down into two areas: hazard class and hazard category. Okay, the hazard class are 10 different health classes and 16 different physical classes. And then the hazard category is the severity, right? So the class is the nature of the hazard, while the category is the severity of that hazard within the class. I have some charts down here to show you a little bit more specifically on that. So the health hazard classes are acute toxicity, skin corrosion irritation, serious eye damage, eye irritation, respiratory or skin sensitization, germ cell mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, specific organ toxicity, single element, specific organ toxicity, repeated or prolonged exposure, or asphyxiation hazard. Okay, these will be listed in the SDS along with their severity. And this is kind of where it gets challenging. The old system, the 1994, it was reversed, and the higher the number, the more severe the hazard was. Well, one of the sacrifices we made with the Globally Harmonized System is they reversed that as far as your health hazards. So the old system, where a high number was bad and a low number was good, is reversed. Okay, so the more severe the hazard is, higher the ladder, or higher than, or the more severe, the lower the number is going to be. So 1 is the most severe in all cases. And this can be challenging, but we need to make sure that when we're looking at our materials and reviewing our materials that we're sending out to our job sites, that we're paying attention to what hazard category we're in. And when we have very high hazards, we need to make sure that we are assessing those hazards and having the correct engineering and PPE and administrative controls in place when we're using them. Physical hazards are listed here, and they all have to do with, the physical properties of different chemicals, right? So the physical hazard class is spelled out, and it has the same type of classification as well, where the category is set up depending on the higher number, the more severe. So, and each is separate depending on which way it works. So if you're working with explosives, they have a very specific division hazard category laid out. With flammable gases and aerosols, they have 2 different categories, division 1 and then unstable, which is a 1. Oxidizing gases are always 1, gases under pressure are always 1, and then flammable liquids have 4 different types. Now, this is a very challenging aspect to the hazard classification system. And this is something that is defined very clearly on the SDS program. It is important that your employees are trained on the severity of the hazard category, okay? Not necessarily that they can spell out how that flammable liquids have 1 through 4, but that they understand that a flammable liquid with a hazard category of 1 is more severe than a flammable liquid with a hazard category of 4. Same with your health hazards. It's important that they understand the numbering system, that the lower number is more severe. So next we go to the written HAZCOM program. And this is where a lot of companies get into a hazard. They don't have a written hazard communication program. And written hazard communication program is pretty low-hanging fruit. It's easy to write. FCA has a manual that is available on their website that includes a compliant hazard communication program that you can utilize. If you email Darlene Schonder, she'll give you a key to access it. So employers have to develop a written program that describes how the standard will be met. It needs to be maintained at each workplace, and I'm going to qualify that on the next couple slides. Okay, so let's not worry too much about that bullet. But it does need to include a list of chemicals present. Okay, a method for employing employees about non-routine hazards, and a location of written program and SDSs. So the list of chemicals present, you need to have a chemical inventory. And this is where many companies miss. At the beginning of their SDS book, they should have a list of a chemical inventory of all the chemicals that they're utilizing within their company. Okay? Now, if we have also defined in that program, if we have a non-routine hazard, say that we don't generally use 3-part epoxies within our company, but a specific project requires a specific material that's of a different hazard, a higher hazard, more severe hazard than we dealt with before. It's important that we have the method defined as to how we're going to communicate that to our employees. We also need to make sure that the location of the written program and SDS is specified within the program, where it will be kept. The program needs to provide instructions for labeling containers, including secondary containers. So when material is transmitted from, say, a 5-gallon bucket to a cut pot, the instructions for labeling that needs to be specified. Okay, and what to do when we're transferring a chemical from one container to another container. So when I said that we need to have the written communication program kept at at the workplace, at every workplace, they do make a distinction for employees that must travel between workplaces and go to different job sites, and as opposed to one central job site that you go to daily. In that situation, you are allowed to keep the written program at the primary workplace facility. Okay, but they also strongly suggest that road crews Those crews who do not operate in one location every day, that's the same location. That road crews carry copies of all the applicable SDSs in a condensed SDS packet, including inventory sheet of what's in that packet. So next, let's talk about labels. On the left, you see the label from the 1994 label requirements. And personally, I feel that the new label that they came out with for the 2012, the GHS, is so much more user-friendly than the old system. The old system had the numbering system with hazard category and hazard class, and that was how you were supposed to be able to tell what the hazard level was. Okay, and that made it extremely difficult because then you had to define this arcane classification system so that everybody understood it, which is challenging at best, right? As a safety professional, I don't know what personal protection level J is, right? So how is somebody that is out in the field, how are we supposed to train to that level? It was very difficult and widely not even attempted, okay? The new labeling requirements are very user-friendly, okay? And that's what you see on the right. It's gonna have, it requires 6 pieces of information to be on that label, okay? And we'll go through each of these, but it's a product identifier or name, a signal word, a pictogram, a hazard statement, cautionary statement, and then information on the chemical manufacturer, okay? And that was all, those are the 6 items that are required on that label. You can see this here, product identifier, right, which is the name, the signal word, either warning or danger, depending on the severity. So although they still have the hazard classification is within the SDS document, on the label itself, they simplified it to a warning or danger, depending on the severity of the hazard. Next, we have the pictograms, which are called out, and there's 9 different pictograms, depending on what the hazard is that may fall under. Next, number 4 is the hazard statement, and this tells you how that chemical is hazardous. Number 5 is the precautionary statement. These are the steps you should take to protect yourself from those hazards, right? And for this chemical, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, it says do not breathe dust, fume, gas, mist, vapor, spray. Wear protective gloves, protective clothing, and eye protection. So that isn't, it doesn't give you all the information you need on the label, right? We don't know what protective gloves work. We don't know what protective clothing is required, and we don't know what level of eye protection is required for using this chemical. But we do know that those are required, and we do know where to get that information. It's the SDS, which is why it's so important that we have it on site. And then last but not least is 6, the chemical company. So we go through it step by step on each of these. I think I pointed out the vast majority of that information. You know, the name can be, product identifier can be the name or it can be a number. The signal word is always danger or warning. Danger being more severe than warning, right? But it's the relatively severity of the hazard and it's easily understood. The pictograms, there's 8 pictograms for safety and then 1 for EPA. If we go across the top row, we have toxic. Next, the O with the flames on top is oxidizer. Next is a compressed gas. Below that is corrosive. Next to that is explosive. Next to that is irritant. Then on the bottom row, you have your flammable. You have your health hazard. And this last one is not a OSHA-related pictogram, but an EPA-related pictogram for dangerous to aquatic life. So the pictograms are pretty straightforward. And here's same description for all 9 of those. And OSHA has plenty of resources to help with hazard communication training on their website. It's easy to find. You go right to their website. It says resources. There'll be training aids, and you can find HazCom close to the top. They actually have some pretty good training aids for this. So next is the hazard statement, right? It'll describe what those hazards are, right? And that depends on its hazard class and category. That's where that information comes from, how the chemical manufacturer determines what needs to be laid on there. And that's not really a big concern to you as far as how it's designed, that since you're not creating this material, it shouldn't be an issue. But it is important that that the people in the field understand what the hazards are. So examples could be fatal if swallowed, fatal if inhaled, severe burns, eye damage, may cause cancer, max explosion hazard. So, it's pretty straightforward as to what the hazards are. Next are the precautionary statements, measures to minimize and prevent those exposures. And then last is the name, address, and telephone number. And the telephone number was added on. That didn't used to be required under the old standard, but it is now. So a lot of your precautionary statements are going to be prevention, response, storage, and disposal. Okay, it's going to often list PPE types, where to store it, and how to take care of it afterwards. So steel, concrete, and other material that's transmitted to the customer. At the time of the initial shipment, it can be sent with an SDS if it requires one, right? So depending on what material you're handling, it may come with an SDS. And you can request SDSs. They should be sending them to you if it requires one. But you can talk to your providers about what solid materials might require an SDS. One question I've had before is, does drywall require an SDS? And the answer is no, at least not United Gypsum or USG. Neither one of them require an SDS. They have an SDS, but the SDS specifically states that there is no hazard. So secondary labeling, and this is a big concern for the finishing trades. We need to make sure that when we transport it in a smaller amount, change it to a different container, that we label, tag, or mark them either with the 5 required items, right? Everything but the address of the manufacturer, or product identifier in words, pictures, symbols, or a combination of these, which provide the general information regarding the hazard of the chemical and the specific information regarding the physical and health hazards of the chemical. I would say that you're probably best off recreating the label and utilizing that. Now, there's a couple different ways we can get around labeling requirements for secondary containers. The first of which is individual stationary process containers. I don't know that there's a lot of that within your industry. I don't believe there is. But if you have a shop that uses stationary process containers to hold this or bulk tanks, you can use signs or placards where you have that information readily accessible and posted on a wall next to it, or on a placard or a clipboard that's next to it. But your containers must be identified, which one's applicable to what. Okay, and it needs to convey all of the information of secondary labeling. You have other issues with transferring a chemical to another container. Okay, so when we are going to transfer the material to a container, and the person that's performing that transfer is also going to be utilizing that material and pouring that material out at the end of the shift, at the end of the day, and not leaving it unattended, then they do not require that it be labeled. Okay, as long as the person has control of that secondary container and doesn't leave it somewhere, then they don't need to put secondary labeling on it. So you can utilize a cut pot, or you can utilize a bucket and pour some into that bucket and utilize that bucket, as long as you keep it with you. So that means not leaving it unattended when you go to break or when you go to lunch. The other issue we need to consider as far as secondary containers is you cannot use anything that resembles a drinking glass, cup, or a container used for consumption. Okay, no Gatorade bottles, no bottles of pop, water bottles filled with the material just because you're using a little bit of it. Those aren't acceptable options. Okay, we can never put it into a beverage container or a food container as a secondary container. So next, as far as removing or defacing existing labels, it's not allowed unless it's immediately marked with the information. And the labels need to be legible and in English and prominently displayed. You can put it in another language if you desire. It's not required to be in other languages than English. So next, let's discuss safety data sheets. So the chemical manufacturer distributor needs to provide safety data sheets. They used to be known as MSDSs, and some companies are still putting out MSDSs, and these are not compliant. I don't really know how to get companies that are not compliant as far as providing SDSs. I imagine if enough of their clients call them and complain, perhaps they'll update them to SDSs. But the majority of your distributors and manufacturers do provide SDSs for the hazardous materials that they use. So it's important that you go through your SDS book and make sure that all of them are up to date, and that the ones that aren't up to date, see if you can get up to date SDSs for them. One big change between the old, the MSDS and the SDS is that there didn't used to be a format for it. So it was the same 4 to 10-page document as the MSDS. But for the MSDS, they could put that information anywhere in it. It made it very difficult to use for anybody that was interested in using it, let alone making it accessible to everybody out in the field. So the SDS now has a standardized into a 16-section format, okay? So here's your 16 sections, and not all sections are going to be terribly important to everybody that utilizes them. Right? Number 2, hazard communication is going to be important to your guys in the field. Composition and info on ingredients probably isn't. However, if you're working in a confined space and you need to know the vapor density of a material or where the lower explosive limit and upper explosive limit, this is information where you can get in section 3, where it has specific composition information on the ingredients. Number 4 is first aid measures. And it's important that people understand where that is in the SDS and how to find it, right? So next is your firefighting measures. If you do have a fire, it's important that you have the SDS available so that you can alert the fire department of what the hazard is, what hazards they may be running into. Or if there's a smaller fire, how to fight it best. If you're working with a highly hazardous chemical and you know it ahead of time and you're working with it within a difficult environment, this is something that you'd want to look at ahead of time and make sure that you're aware of. Same with accidental release measures, which is section 6. 7 is handling and storage. Number 8 is your exposure controls and PPE. So when we were looking at the label earlier and we saw the section said, you know, wear gloves, protective clothing, and eye protection. Section 8 is where it's going to define what that protection is. If it says respiratory protection, it'll tell you whether you need an organic cartridge or an ammonia cartridge, okay, or whether it's just an N95. Section 8 is very important to foremen out in the field and for superintendents to be able to understand how those employees should be protected. Physical and chemical properties, stability and reactivity, toxicology information. All of this information down here is very important, and it may not be safety issues for all of them. Some of them are going to be environmental issues. OSHA doesn't enforce sections 12 through 15, right? But DOT is interested in your transportation information, and this is all good information, right? We need to make sure that our employees understand what the different sections are for and how, you know, how they could use them. And like I said, they may not use each and every section of this, but the sections that they can use, they need to know where they are and how to find them. In the old MSDSs, the first aid measures could be anywhere between the first page and the last page. You didn't know where it was going to end up being. In the new SDS, it's always section 4. We talked before about the hazard rating numbers where the order was reversed. The old NFPA standard had 0 and 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 being a severe hazard, 0 being minimal, and we've reversed that. 1 through 5, and 5 is minimal while 1 is severe. And that's all located in number 2 of the SDS, which is your hazard communication. They're also no longer required on your container labels. And largely this has to do with people's understanding of the classification systems, right? The signal word of warning or danger takes the place of the classification on the label, right? That way it's more user-friendly. So you can see an old one would have whatever order that they wanted for the MSDS, while the new one has a specified, defined order. You can always find first aid at 4, right? You can always find PPE at 8. So it's important that your employees understand where they can find what within the SDS. We want to make sure that we make that SDS accessible to them physically, but also we want to make it usable to them, right? And this standard has gone a long way into making it usable. What it takes is a little bit of training to make sure we get the rest of the way there, okay? So SDSs need to be maintained and readily accessible at each workplace. And when they travel between, they can be kept at a primary workplace. But they need to be able to get that information in an emergency, and strongly recommended that the road crews carry copies of the SDSs. And this can be done by putting together an SDS packet for each job. When we go and we bid a job and we know what materials we're going to be using, it would be pretty easy as a company to print out SDSs for this specific job, staple it, and make sure that the foreman has it in his truck. And get into the habit of doing that for each and every job so that the foreman's aware of that. You can keep it in the gang box on each job. You can send it out in the gang box with the tools to the job. So there's many different administrative processes, systems that you can put in place to make sure that these are readily available. So employee training is an important aspect of this that often falls short. So let's talk about when we need to train. Initial assignment, right? Before you expose a hazard, an employee to a hazard, or put them into an area where there's hazardous chemicals being worked on, you need to make sure that they're trained on hazard communication, that they know what the pictograms are, what labeling is, what's in your hazard communication program, right? You need to make sure that they understand what the sections of an SDS are and how to read it. So that initial assignment is when it needs to be performed, generally as part of your new hire orientation. You also have to retain them anytime you expose them to a new chemical hazard. Okay, so when I'm talking about a new chemical hazard, that does not necessarily mean, let's pick a painting company, and we're using one brand of paint, we switch to another brand of paint that has a different SDS. As long as the hazards on the two different types of paint are the same, as long as we don't have a huge difference in classification and that we're following the same hazard class, if we've already covered that hazard class and how to handle that material, then we don't need to retrain them because we're using the same chemical for a different company, right? But if we move from a solvent like paint thinner to a solvent like MEK or a solvent like xylene, we need to make sure that we've trained them on what those hazards are, okay? So when we're introducing a new chemical hazard, if we have already trained them on a chemical hazard that is equivalent, then we don't need to train them. It's not considered a new chemical hazard, okay? It's only when the chemical hazard has not been trained before. We introduce something that's corrosive when we have not trained them prior on any corrosive materials or any SDSs with corrosive on it. They don't know how to protect themselves. They don't know what the hazards are involved with corrosive materials. We're going to need to make sure that we bring them in and retrain them, okay? We need to make sure that the chemical specific information is always available, primarily through labels, right? All of our chemicals need to be labeled when they get sent out to their job site, and those labels need to stay legible when they're out there, and also through safety data sheets. And you know, this last paragraph here, I'm gonna read word for word off of it. It comes from OSHA. Actually, I go to the next one, and it defines it. It's spelled out a little bit better here, broken up a little bit more. OSHA requires employers to present information in a manner and language that our employees can understand. Okay, this has been a shift in OSHA over the last few years where they're changing our training requirements. So it's not enough to just train somebody. We have to train somebody so that they can understand what we're training. If the employer customarily need to communicate work instructions or other workplace information to employees in a language other than English, then they'll also need to provide that safety and health training in the same manner. If your employee does not understand English enough for you to communicate with work instructions, you also cannot communicate safety training, okay? You need to make sure that you're doing it in a language they can understand. If your vocabulary is limited, then the training must account for that limitation. Okay, you have to make sure that once again, we need to make sure that training is accessible, right? Accessible to those employees. And if the employees are not literate, telling them to read training materials is not going to satisfy the employer's training obligation. Now, this was taken word for word off of OSHA, but I would not try to use this sentence as justification for only giving your employees written materials, telling them to read it. I don't suggest that. I suggest that you go through a toolbox talks where a foreman explains everything to them and then get them sign off, or send them out to specific training for hazard communication. And that really applies to all safety training. So employees need to be informed of any operation in their work area where hazardous chemicals are present. And they also need to be alerted to the location and availability of hazard communication program, where the written one is, where the list of chemicals are, and where the SDSs are. Okay, so that needs to be a part of that training. They also need to be trained on how to detect the presence of the hazardous chemicals in the work area. If you're working with chemicals that require respiratory protection, how does an employee tell if that material is in the air, right? They also have to be told of simple asphyxiation, combustible dust, pyrophoric gas hazards, and any other hazards that aren't classified in the work area that they'll be working in. So we largely do this through training on 3 things to protect them. Appropriate work practices, emergency procedures, and what PPE is going to be used, right? So appropriate work practices may be ventilating an area when you're utilizing a chemical that has respiratory content that is hazardous, right? Emergency procedures as far as what do we do if there is a fire or some other hazard that is set up by this. Now this depends on the scope of what the work that your facility does. If you have specific hazards that are more hazardous, as far as like flammability, or if you're working in spaces where the atmospheric hazards of these chemicals are higher, we need to make sure that those emergency procedures are dealt with. Okay, and we also need to tell them how we're going to handle labeling and what your workplace labeling system is. and what your SDS system is. So here's some of the dates. You know, they're all past. This standard has been up for 7 years now, about. So there's been plenty of time to get on board with it. OSHA is not giving any more leeway on it. So we need to make sure that we have all of these training requirements, your written communication program requirements, your SDS requirements, your labeling requirements. They all need to be taken care of. I'm going to open it up for questions. While I'm waiting for any questions, the safety helpline is available through the FCA. That phone generally rings on my desk, and if it goes to voicemail, I always try to make sure I respond to those responses within 24 hours.
Hey, Mike, this is Bob Weaver. So
Hey,
that,
Bob.
if I understand correctly, then everything that we've been doing as far as the silica would follow these same rules, because that's what's found in the SDS sheets, as well as the protection, respiratory requirements, engineering controls, etc. Right?
Yep.
Outstanding.
Yeah, and this definitely applies to silica. A lot of materials that you guys use silica may be the only hazardous material within that material. So if it has enough silica, it becomes a hazardous chemical because it does have health effects.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. When we talk about the annual training, the annual updating, as long as we're not introducing any new and additional hazards, new chemical hazards into the workplace, a good question is, will a toolbox talk qualify as that annual refresher training? And the answer is yes, it can, as long as it's performed correctly, as long as we have the foreman reading off the sheet to make sure people understand, and it's done in a language that they understand, then that can count as our training. FCA offers a Toolbox Talk program, over 200 Toolbox Talks in both English and Spanish, including one specifically for the finishing trades. If you'd like a key, talk to Darlene Schonder, you know her number. And then also we'd like to alert you to the monthly safety bulletin that Jeremy Fitch sends out every month. That includes an FCA safety update, 2 focus of the month articles, and then 2 blogs on current safety topics. So please feel free to take a look at those. When they pop up in your mailbox, check them out. FCA is doing what they can to add value and make sure that these questions are asked. We also have the monthly safety call that we have on the 3rd Tuesday of the month, 3rd full week of the month. That Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Look out for those notification emails as well. That's really all I have for you today. If anybody else has any other questions, please feel free to ask. If you'd like a PDF copy of this presentation, I will be sending that in to Darlene, and you can request it from her, and she should have it within the next day or 2. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.